The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood where David Carter lived. The streets were lined with neatly manicured lawns, freshly painted houses, and pristine cars parked in driveways. It was the kind of neighborhood where families felt safe, where children rode their bikes without fear, and where neighbors exchanged polite nods across hedges. David had chosen this place deliberately when he returned home from his final tour overseas. After years of service in the military, fighting in some of the most dangerous regions in the world, he had wanted peace. He had earned peace. David was a man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a lean build that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. His face bore the lines of both age and experience, but his eyes were kind, thoughtful. His skin, dark and smooth, contrasted against the light-colored suit he wore, an outfit he had put on for the veterans event he had attended earlier in the day. It had been a small local gathering, a way for veterans to connect, share stories, and support one another. For David, these events were a rare comfort, a reminder that there were still people who understood the sacrifices he had made. As he walked home, his steps steady and unhurried, he thought about the speech he had given earlier. It was one he had been asked to deliver many times, a story of bravery, honor, and the love of his country. He didn't mind telling it, though sometimes it felt like the story belonged to someone else. There were parts of his service he never talked about, the parts that kept him up at night, but those weren't the kind of stories people wanted to hear. No, they wanted the hero's tale, and David had learned how to give it to them. In one hand he carried a small leather bag, inside of which were his service medals, tokens of a life spent fighting for his country. He was proud of those medals. Each one represented a moment when he had stood tall in the face of danger. But as proud as he was, he knew they didn't protect him from the way people sometimes saw him. It was still early evening, but the streets were nearly empty. The only sound was the gentle hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the soft breeze. David felt a familiar sense of calm wash over him. This was why he had chosen this neighborhood, quiet, peaceful, and far removed from the chaos he had known. But as he turned onto his street, that sense of calm was interrupted by the distant flash of red and blue lights. A police cruiser slowly rolled down the street, its presence both ominous and out of place in the otherwise serene setting. David barely glanced at it, his mind elsewhere. He had never had any trouble with the law, and he certainly wasn't doing anything suspicious. But as the cruiser passed him, he couldn't help but feel a familiar tension rise in his chest, a tension that came from years of knowing that, in the eyes of some people, a black man walking alone in a predominantly white neighborhood was enough to warrant suspicion. Inside the cruiser, Officer Jake Peterson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes narrowing as he spotted David. Peterson was young, barely 30, and still relatively new to the force. He had grown up in a nearby town, one much like this one, safe, suburban, and predominantly white. His upbringing had shaped his worldview, and although he wouldn't have admitted it, Peterson carried with him a set of assumptions about people who looked like David. He had been patrolling the neighborhood for a few months now, and though it was usually quiet, the local police department had recently received complaints about unfamiliar people walking around. Nothing specific, just vague reports from concerned residents. Peterson knew what they really meant: black or brown faces in a neighborhood where they didn't often belong. He tried not to think of himself as racist, but deep down he had learned to associate certain faces with trouble. "Dispatch, this is Peterson," he said into his radio. "Got a male, black, mid to late 40s walking down Elm Street. Gonna stop and check him out." The voice on the other end of the radio crackled. "Copy that, Peterson. Stay safe." Peterson's heart raced slightly as he slowed the cruiser to a stop. His hand instinctively went to his side, resting near his holster, a habit he had developed, one born out of both training and fear. He wasn't sure why, but something about the man made him uneasy. Maybe it was the suit, too nice for someone who didn't seem to belong here. Or maybe it was just that David's presence didn't fit the image Peterson had in his mind of who should be walking these streets at this hour. David heard the cruiser stop behind him and felt his stomach tighten. He knew this feeling all too well, the sense of being watched, being judged. Slowly he turned around, keeping his hands visible at his sides. He had been through enough interactions with law enforcement to know the importance of making sure his movements weren't misunderstood. "Good evening," Officer David said calmly, his voice steady but polite. Peterson stepped out of the car, his face a mask of authority. He didn't return the greeting. Instead, he approached David with measured steps, his eyes scanning him from head to toe. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" Peterson asked, his tone brusque. David raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "I'm walking home," he replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" Peterson's eyes narrowed. "You live around here?" David nodded. "Yes, just a few blocks away. I've lived here for a couple of years now." Peterson crossed his arms, clearly not convinced. "Got some ID on you?" David sighed inwardly but kept his face calm. "Sure," he said, reaching slowly into his pocket. He knew better than to make any sudden moves. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Peterson took the ID, glancing at it briefly before looking back at David. There was nothing suspicious about it. David was who he said he was, and he lived in the neighborhood. But something still didn't sit right with Peterson. His instincts, or rather his biases, told him that there was more to this than met the eye. "What's in the bag?" Peterson asked, gesturing to the leather case David was carrying. David hesitated for a moment before answering. "Just some things from an event I attended. My service medals mostly." "Service medals?" Peterson repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "Yes," David replied, meeting his gaze. "I'm a veteran." Peterson felt a flicker of doubt, but he quickly brushed it aside. It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to use a story like that to get out of trouble. He stepped closer, his posture more confrontational. "Mind if I take a look?" David's jaw clenched slightly, but he kept his composure. "I'd prefer if you didn't," he said quietly. "Those medals are personal. I don't think this is necessary." Peterson's eyes hardened. "Look, we've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area, and I need to make sure everything checks out." David took a deep breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I've done nothing wrong. I'm just walking home." The tension between them was thick now, the calm evening air seeming to vibrate with unspoken hostility. David could see where this was headed, and it wasn't anywhere good. He had been through this kind of situation before too many times, in fact. No matter how respectful or calm he remained, it always seemed to end the same way. Just then, a second police car pulled up, its lights flashing as it stopped beside Peterson's cruiser. Officer Laura Green stepped out, her expression unreadable. She was older than Peterson, more experienced, and had been on the force for nearly 15 years. But like Peterson, she carried with her the same set of biases, shaped by years of policing in a predominantly white community. "What's going on here?" Green asked as she approached. "Just checking this guy out," Peterson replied, jerking his head in David's direction. "Says he lives in the neighborhood." Green's eyes flicked to David, her gaze just as cold and suspicious. "Got any reason to doubt that?" Peterson shrugged. "Don't know yet." David could feel his pulse quicken as the two officers conferred, their voices low but their postures unmistakably hostile. He had hoped that a second officer might de-escalate the situation, but it seemed to be having the opposite effect. He stood there, waiting, his hands still at his sides, knowing that anything he said could be twisted against him. "We're going to need you to come with us," Peterson finally said, stepping forward, "just to clear things up." David's heart sank. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "We can sort it out at the station," Green said, her voice flat. "Let's go." For a moment, David considered refusing, standing his ground, insisting that he had every right to be there. But he knew how that would end. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his hands. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll come with you." As Peterson moved to cuff him, David couldn't help but glance at the nearby houses. A few people were watching from their windows, some even holding up their phones to record the scene. He wondered if any of them knew him, if any of them recognized the man who had risked his life for his country, only to come home and be treated like a criminal. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, David felt a cold wave of humiliation wash over him. This was not the first time he had been profiled, and he doubted it would be the last. But somehow this time felt worse. He had served his country, fought for its freedoms, and yet here he was reduced to a suspect in his own neighborhood, simply because of the color of his skin. David Carter sat in the back seat of the police cruiser, his hands cuffed behind him, the cool metal biting into his wrists. The streets blurred past the window as Officer Jake Peterson drove in tense silence. Officer Laura Green followed in her own car, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. His military training had taught him how to handle stressful situations, but this being treated like a criminal in his own country, in his own neighborhood, was different. It stung in a way that no battlefield injury ever could. The ride to the police station felt interminable. The quiet inside the car was thick with tension. David stared out the window, watching the familiar suburban homes fade into the cityscape as they neared the station. A part of him still hoped this was all a misunderstanding, that once they got to the station and the officers realized who he was, they'd apologize and let him go. But another part of him, the part that had lived as a black man in America for nearly 50 years, knew better. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, the knot in David's stomach tightened. The cruiser came to a stop and Peterson got out, walking around to open David's door. Without a word, Peterson helped him out of the car and guided him toward the station entrance. The lights inside the building flickered coldly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the polished floors. Officer Green followed closely behind, her face still set in an unreadable expression. Inside, the station buzzed with the usual late-night activity. A few officers milled about, processing paperwork, answering phones, or handling minor disturbances. David's presence drew some glances, some curious, others indifferent. He was just another black man in handcuffs, after all. Nothing out of the ordinary. They led David to a small interrogation room at the back of the station. It was sterile and unwelcoming, with bare walls, a metal table, and 2 chairs. Peterson motioned for David to sit, and he complied, feeling the cold of the chair seep into his bones. His hands were still cuffed behind his back, the position uncomfortable and humiliating. "We're going to run your information and see if everything checks out," Peterson said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "Just sit tight." David didn't respond. He simply nodded and waited as Peterson and Green left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He stared at the table in front of him, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly. This wasn't the first time he had been detained by the police without cause, but it was the first time it had gone this far. He had always managed to de-escalate things before they spiraled out of control. But tonight, something had gone wrong. He wondered if it had been his refusal to let Peterson search his bag, or maybe the simple fact that he had dared to walk in his own neighborhood at the wrong time. In the hallway outside, Peterson and Green stood at a computer, running David's information through the system. Peterson's fingers drummed impatiently on the desk as they waited for the results to load. Green watched the screen with a furrowed brow, her arms crossed. "You sure about this?" Green asked quietly, her voice laced with doubt. Peterson shot her a look. "What do you mean?" Green shrugged. "I don't know. He doesn't seem like the type to be causing trouble. Something about this doesn't sit right with me." Peterson scoffed. "What? Because he says he's a veteran? People lie all the time to get out of trouble." Green didn't reply immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the interrogation room, where David sat alone. Something about the whole situation made her uneasy, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Just feels off," she muttered. Before Peterson could respond, the computer beeped, and the screen filled with information. Both officers leaned in, their eyes scanning the results. Peterson's face went pale as he read the details. David Carter, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army, recipient of multiple commendations, including a Bronze Star Medal for valor in combat. "Oh shit," Peterson muttered under his breath. Green's eyes widened as she read the same information. "He's telling the truth," she said, her voice tight with shock. "He really is a veteran." Peterson ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. This wasn't just some guy trying to get out of trouble, this was a decorated war hero. He felt a knot of guilt form in his chest as he realized the gravity of their mistake. "We need to go in there and tell him," Green said, her voice low but firm. "We need to release him." Peterson hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of duty. He didn't want to admit he had been wrong, but there was no denying the facts in front of him. Still, a part of him clung to the idea that he had been justified in his actions. After all, David had seemed suspicious, hadn't he? And Peterson had only been doing his job. "Look, we'll go in there," Peterson said, his voice strained, "but we need to be careful how we handle this. We can't just let him walk out without making sure everything is cleared up." Green shot him a look of disbelief. "We've already humiliated him enough. We need to apologize and let him go. He's not some criminal." Peterson didn't respond. He knew Green was right, but admitting fault wasn't easy for him. With a sigh, he turned and headed back toward the interrogation room, Green following close behind. When they entered the room, David looked up, his face expressionless. He had expected them to return with more accusations or demands, but instead, there was a strange tension in the air. "Mr. Carter," Green began, her tone softer than before, "we've run your information, and it seems you were telling the truth about your military service." David didn't say anything. He just watched them, waiting for what came next. "We're going to remove your handcuffs," she continued, stepping forward to do just that. "We're sorry for the inconvenience." As Green unlocked the cuffs, David flexed his wrists, rubbing the sore spots where the metal had dug into his skin. He remained silent, his eyes flicking between the two officers. He could tell they were trying to backtrack, but the damage had already been done. Peterson cleared his throat, his voice stiff. "We didn't know who you were when we stopped you. There have been some complaints in the area, and we were just following up." David raised an eyebrow but still said nothing. "There was no reason to detain you like this," Green added, shooting a pointed look at Peterson. "You're free to go." David stood slowly, his movements controlled, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to explode, to let loose all the frustration and anger that had built up during the past few hours. But another part of him, the part that had learned restraint, that had endured far worse on foreign soil, told him to stay calm. "Thank you," David said finally, his voice quiet but firm. He didn't offer them any grace in his tone, they didn't deserve it. Without another word, David picked up his leather bag from the table and turned to leave. As he walked out of the interrogation room, he could feel the weight of their stares on his back, but he didn't look back. He didn't need to see their faces to know that they were relieved to be rid of him, to have the situation resolved without further incident. Outside the station, the cool night air hit David like a balm, but it did little to soothe the ache in his chest. He paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the sky, the stars dim against the city's light pollution. He was free, but he didn't feel free. The cuffs might be off his wrists, but the sense of being bound by something far larger, something systemic, something deeply ingrained in the fabric of his society remained. As he stood there, trying to collect himself, he heard footsteps approaching. Turning slightly, he saw Officer Green walking toward him, her expression somber. For a moment, David considered walking away without acknowledging her, but something in her eyes stopped him. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Green said, her voice low but earnest. "I know that doesn't make up for what happened, but I am sorry." David studied her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of real understanding. He could see that she meant the words, but he also knew that it wasn't enough. Apologies didn't undo years of systemic racism. Apologies didn't erase the humiliation he had felt when those cuffs had been slapped onto his wrists. And apologies didn't change the fact that, for people like him, these kinds of encounters were all too common. "Thank you," David said, his voice cool and measured. It was all he could muster. Green nodded, sensing the unspoken weight behind his words. She opened her mouth to say something more but seemed to think better of it. With a final nod, she turned and walked back into the station, leaving David alone once again. David turned and began walking down the street, his mind swirling with thoughts and emotions. He wasn't sure where to go from here. Part of him wanted to retreat into the safety of his home, to shut the door and block out the world. But another part of him, the part that had always fought for justice, for what was right, knew that this wasn't something he could ignore. Something had to change, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. As he walked into the night, David resolved to speak out. His silence had been a shield for too long, but now it was time to wield his voice like a weapon against the injustice that had taken root in the very soil of the country he had fought to protect. The days following David Carter's wrongful arrest were a blur of confusion, anger, and quiet reflection. The viral video captured by one of the bystanders had spread like wildfire, drawing attention far beyond the quiet suburban neighborhood where it had all begun. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another case of racial profiling and police misconduct. The images of David, a calm, well-dressed black man being handcuffed and led into a police car, were shown on countless screens, sparking outrage and heated debate. For David, the media frenzy was overwhelming. He had spent his life avoiding the spotlight, preferring the quiet dignity of service to public displays of attention. But now it seemed he had no choice. His phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, civil rights organizations, and fellow veterans who had seen the video. Even old friends from the military reached out, offering their support and sharing their own stories of injustice. It was both heartening and exhausting. David sat at his kitchen table, his leather bag resting nearby, the metals inside now tainted with the memory of that humiliating night. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He sipped his coffee, his mind racing. He hadn't been able to sleep much since the arrest. His thoughts kept returning to the moment when the handcuffs had clicked shut around his wrists. The sense of helplessness he had felt in that moment haunted him. He wasn't sure how to move forward. Part of him wanted to let it go, to retreat into the safety of his home and forget it ever happened. But another part of him, the part that had fought on the front lines and seen the horrors of war, knew that this wasn't something he could ignore. Not anymore. The sound of a knock at the door broke his reverie. David stood, moving slowly to the door, unsure of who it could be. When he opened it, he was surprised to find a small group of people standing on his porch, their faces familiar. They were local veterans, men and women he had met at events over the years, all dressed in their military attire. David, one of them, a tall man named Paul, said, his voice quiet but firm, "We heard about what happened. We wanted to come by and show our support." David stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. The group filed into his living room, their expressions somber but resolute. They sat down in the chairs and on the couch, filling the space with a quiet but palpable sense of solidarity. "We've all seen the video," Paul continued, once everyone was seated. "And we're angry. This shouldn't have happened to you. It shouldn't happen to anyone, but especially not to someone who's given so much for this country." David nodded, his throat tight. He hadn't expected this kind of response from his fellow veterans, but it warmed him to know that they were behind him. "What can I do?" David asked, his voice low. "I didn't ask for any of this." One of the women, a fellow veteran named Karen, leaned forward. "You can speak out, David. People need to hear your story. They need to understand what happened and why it's wrong. You've always been a leader, and now you have a chance to lead again." David shook his head, his brow furrowed. "I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist. I'm just a guy trying to live his life in peace." Karen's eyes softened. "I know. But sometimes we don't get to choose when we're called to serve. You know that better than anyone." David sighed, running a hand over his face. He understood what she was saying, but the idea of stepping into the public eye like this made him uneasy. Still, deep down, he knew she was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. "I'll think about it," David said finally, his voice quiet. Paul nodded. "Take your time. But know that we're with you, whatever you decide." The group stayed for a while longer, sharing stories of their own experiences with law enforcement and discussing the broader issue of racial profiling. As they spoke, David felt a sense of purpose beginning to form within him, a quiet resolve to do something, even if he wasn't sure what that was yet. After they left, David sat alone in his living room, the weight of their words settling over him like a heavy cloak. He wasn't ready to step into the public eye just yet, but he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. The next day, David received a call from the local news station. They had been covering the story extensively, and now they wanted an interview. At first, David hesitated, but after a long moment of silence, he agreed. If he was going to speak out, he wanted to do it on his own terms. The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon. As the hours ticked by, David felt a growing sense of nervousness. He had faced far more dangerous situations in his life, but this felt different. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the idea of sharing his story with the world made him uncomfortable. But he knew it had to be done. When the news crew arrived at his house, David met them with quiet dignity. The interviewer, a young woman with a friendly smile, set up her camera and microphone in the living room. She asked David if he was ready, and after taking a deep breath, he nodded. The camera rolled, and the interviewer began with a soft, empathetic question. "David, can you tell us what happened the night you were arrested?" David's eyes flicked to the camera, then back to the interviewer. He took another deep breath, steadying himself. "I was walking home from a veterans event," he began, his voice calm but strong. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I thought I was safe here. But that night, the police stopped me for no reason. They questioned me, detained me, and put me in handcuffs because of the way I looked, because of my skin color." The interviewer nodded, her expression serious. "How did that make you feel?" David's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. "It made me feel like I didn't belong. Like everything I've done, everything I've fought for, meant nothing in the eyes of those officers. I served my country, I risked my life for the freedoms we all enjoy. But that night, I was just another black man in handcuffs. And that's something no one should have to experience, especially not in their own country." The interviewer paused, giving David a moment to collect himself before asking, "What do you hope will come out of this? What do you want people to take away from your story?" David thought for a moment, his eyes distant. "I want people to understand that this isn't just about me. This is about a system that's broken. A system that treats people of color differently, that assumes guilt based on appearance. I want people to see that racial profiling is real, and it's happening every day, to people who have done nothing wrong. I want change, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been in my shoes." The interview continued for a few more minutes, with David speaking candidly about his experiences and the broader issues of racism and policing in America. By the time it was over, he felt a strange sense of relief. He had spoken his truth, and now it was out there for the world to see. In the days that followed, David's interview aired on local news and quickly spread online. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from all over the country, veterans, activists, ordinary citizens, all reaching out to offer their solidarity. But with the support also came backlash. Some viewers criticized David for speaking out, accusing him of trying to make the police look bad, or suggesting that he had done something to warrant the arrest. It was a painful reminder that not everyone was willing to acknowledge the reality of racism in America. Despite the backlash, David remained resolute. He had found his voice, and now he was determined to use it. He began attending community meetings, speaking out about racial profiling and police reform. He joined forces with local activists and veterans groups, pushing for changes in police training and accountability. One evening, a local community center hosted a town hall meeting to discuss the issue of racial profiling in their neighborhood. David was invited to speak, and though he was nervous, he knew this was his chance to make a difference. The room was packed with residents, police officers, and city officials. As David stood at the podium, he felt the weight of their eyes on him, but he also felt the support of those who stood with him, his fellow veterans, the activists who had been fighting this battle long before he had. David cleared his throat, his voice steady but firm. "I didn't ask to be in this position," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But now that I'm here, I have a responsibility to speak out. What happened to me could happen to anyone. And it's happening every day in neighborhoods just like this one. We need to do better. We need to change the way we think about race, the way we think about policing, and the way we treat one another." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for justice, for fairness, for the right to walk down the street without being treated like a criminal. I fought for this country. I fought for the freedoms we all enjoy. And I believe in those freedoms, but they mean nothing if they aren't extended to everyone." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of David's words hanging in the air. Then slowly, one by one, people began to applaud. The sound grew louder, filling the room, and for the first time since that night, David felt a sense of hope. He had taken a stand, and people were listening. As the applause continued, David stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He had found his voice, and now there was no turning back.